Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by upset prevention and recovery instructor Randy Brooks. He tells us why loss of control still causes so many accidents, how upset training is different from aerobatics, and what it's like to fly the L-39 jet. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archives. And remember to leave us a review in your favorite podcast app so other pilots can find the show. Today, I'm joined by Randy Brooks, who is probably America's premier instructor for upset prevention and recovery training, or UPRT. He does that as Executive Vice President at Aviation Performance Solutions, a company that offers training courses in both piston and jet aircraft, as well as simulators. Randy is an ATP with over 14,000 hours of flight time, including 8,000 in tailwheel aircraft and 6,000 of aerobatics. Before he was an instructor, he was an airshow pilot, flying over 500 demonstrations, and he was even inducted into the Airshow Hall of Fame in 2015. In other words, he has probably been upside down about as much as anyone I've ever met. Randy, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thank you very much, John. It's my pleasure to participate today.
You've written about, you've presented on, you've done videos on loss of control and upset prevention training. Let's start by defining some terms. So I'm sure most of our listeners are aware of the term loss of control in flight, or LOC-I, LOC-I. It's pronounced 100 different ways. Let's explain what that actually means and why it's so important.
So there are some parameters that were defined when the industry started to look at this in the late 90s. And what they came up with was a pitch attitude of more than 25 degrees nose up, 15 degrees nose down, or 45 degrees of bank. But that really was for swept wing transport aircraft of over 100 passengers. So those parameters don't hold precisely to turboprop and propeller aircraft. But anyway, it's getting beyond the range that the pilot is normally operating in. Now, we actually train pilots in normal flying. We're normally flying to about 30 degrees of bank, little nose up, little nose low. And then without parachutes on, we're restricted to 60 degrees of bank, 30 degrees of pitch. But in an upset event, we can go to any pitch or bank attitude that the aircraft is capable of. And we've seen aircraft as large as Boeings and Airbuses that get to this point. But loss of control in flight, or the upsets which lead to loss of control in flight, actually are constituted by stalls as well. And so for upsets, which lead to loss of control in flight, you have two things that are combined together that all your listeners that are pilots are going to be familiar with, and that's the unusual attitude training that they do and the stall training or approach to stall training. When that upset event gets beyond the pilot's ability to control it with the skills that he has been provided by licensing training, then that pilot, he or she, is experiencing a loss of control. They have not been equipped with the skills that they need to deal with that. And so upset prevention and recovery training is targeting training that is designed specifically to mitigate that loss of control in flight risk. Now, the reason that it is so important is that loss of control in flight has been the number one cause of fatalities for over a quarter of a century now. And it doesn't matter where in the world you're talking about or what sector of aviation you're talking about, whether it's general aviation, instructional aviation, NTSB, Part 135, Part 121. And in fact, in some measures, it's actually getting worse. When I began down this road in 2006, loss of control in flight and controlled flight and terrain were about tied for the number of fatalities tracked over a 10-year period by Boeing and the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. But now, loss of control in flight is clearly ahead. And in fact, this year, that data points to the fact that 66% of all fatalities worldwide in the commercial air carrier category have been due to loss of control in flight. So although during that period, 2006 to now, there's been a lot of improvements made in how we prepare pilots to fly in the normal envelope, unfortunately, our training of most pilots is not adequate for what they need if they get outside of the normal envelope. And that's what UPRT provides.
It is amazing. You look at that CFIT, controlled flight into terrain chart, and we've almost solved that problem, at least at the airline level. The number of those has dropped dramatically. Seems like a lot of the solution there has been technology, ground proximity warning systems, and TAWs. But it doesn't seem like loss of control is a problem that can be solved just by technology. Do you think that's why it's been so persistent?
That is precisely it, John, is that loss of control in flight is pilot-centric. Now, we do have fly-by-wire flight envelope protections in, all the Airbus aircraft now, and more and more business jets. But that does not totally encompass the problem that pilots are faced with, which in many cases are human factors related. And, where do professional pilots do the majority of their training? In the simulator. And the simulator just does not recreate the psychological situation that pilots are involved in. And so, what upset prevention and recovery training, we can do it all in the simulator, but it's not going to take pilots to the domain that they're going to experience it in flight. And so that's why a component of on-aircraft training is important. But more importantly than that, I think that a lot of pilots are not aware of the limitations of the simulator. Until 2020, airline simulators did not have to go beyond the first indication of stall, and general aviation aircraft still do not. They are only certified up to the first indication of stall. Well, unfortunately, the real weirdness, the behavior that pilots are not familiar with, occurs beyond critical angle of attack. And even in those aircraft that have an enhanced envelope at the 121 air carrier world, they do a little bit better job of projecting what pilots might be associated with, but in terms of aerodynamic programming, but they aren't going to be able to provide the physiology. And I can tell you that when pilots are subjected to positive Gs, less than 1G, or even negative Gs, or all of the vibrations and buffeting, sometimes severe, that they can be subjected to in an upset, they're not going to get better. They're not going to get smarter. As we like to say around here, as your heart rate goes up, your IQ goes down. And so we have to prepare pilots with the degree of intensity that they are going to face in the real world. When I began training here at APS, I figured I was going to be teaching pilots some fancy flying skills, and that certainly is true. But what I rather quickly, after flying with hundreds, now it's over 1,000 pilots, began to see is that more importantly, what UPRT provides is access, the pilot's ability to actually perform to the proficiency required in the face of an unexpected upset event. And that takes a certain amount of repetition to proficiency. It takes a very building block approach so that we don't overwhelm the pilot. We have to build up to that point. And it takes a foundational academic understanding to make sure that they understand why they need to do things differently in an upset than they might do the majority of the time that they're flying, because the aerodynamics that they're involved with are a little bit different.
You mentioned the psychological part, and I would guess that some listeners have heard of UPRT and are just flat out afraid of it. I don't want to get upset. I don't want to go upside down and feel negative Gs. How do you address that with clients when they come train with you?
Not only are they perhaps physically afraid of being upside down, a lot of times a big fear is being having motion sensitivity. And, I have a lot of experience from my airshow background giving rides to non-pilots. And so I have a pretty small ratio, which I tracked for a period of time. And it was 4% of people that got actively motion sick. It's a part of the job. We prepare for it. We have 6X and everything available, and we're ready to interrupt training whenever we need to, because if somebody is not feeling well, they're not going to be learning. But for the vast majority of people, it's not an issue at all. And for many of those people that were afraid physically of upset recovery, they find out that it's nothing like what it was that they were afraid of. For instance, when we do an aileron roll, you don't feel like you're hanging from the straps upside down like you would if you were standing on your head. Things are different, and a lot of people, most people, end up really liking it. But the other thing, and it's part of the many requirements of a skilled UPRT instructor is that we have to be very sensitive to the folks that we're flying with and help them to work up to that point, and slowly introduce the aerodynamic concepts and the practical skill development in a way that is not so bad and that they can keep up with. And, it's one student, one instructor in the cockpit. So we are always kind of personalizing, customizing the flight to the individual that we have involved, making it transferable to the aircraft and the type of flying that they're used to.
So we've identified the problem, loss of control, and the solution is upset prevention recovery training, or at least part of the solution. Let's talk about what that actually means. I think some pilots maybe believe it's just aerobatics training. We're going to go do loops and rolls. But what's an actual UPRT training flight look like? What am I going to do if I go fly with you?
Well, certainly some of the confusion is around the fact that both UPRT and aerobatics involve some component of all attitude training and flight operation. In the case of aerobatics, it's all about proficiency. It's about doing specific maneuvers specific to the airplane that you're in. Upset prevention recovery training, done correctly, should be transferable. That is the big word. When we started down this road and it evolved from emergency maneuver training to upset recovery training to upset prevention recovery training, obviously, if we're doing 8-point vertical rolls in an extra 300, that has no transferability to a King Air. But if I am showing pilots how by unloading the aircraft to reduce G, they are reducing their angle of attack and therefore can use that to recover from a stall or help them in certain other situations, that half a G that they experience in an extra 300 or a Cy Marchetti S211 is exactly like the half a G that they're going to feel in a King Air, a Gulfstream, or a 737. So that is the sophistication of UPRT. It started with aerobatics, and there are certainly components of that in terms of the intensity, in terms of the orientation, in terms of showing pilots what the flight path of their aircraft would be in an upset, which is very different when you're cruising along with the four forces of flight all in balance. That will help them to understand, oh, that's why I need to roll faster in a rolling upset event than I might be willing to do normally with my passengers, because the nose is going to be falling towards the ground because my vertical component of lift is being reduced. So those are the subjects that we go into, but we have to practice them in a way that they are there at a moment's notice when a pilot isn't expecting it. And that brings us to one of the biggest differences between aerobatics and UPRT. In aerobatics, I know exactly what maneuver I'm doing. In competition aerobatics, I know a sequence I'm flying in front of judges. In an air show, I know a routine that I've practiced and am able to do safely close to the ground. An upset is not something that anybody ever expected. They were not planning on it that day. Otherwise, they would have stopped it in the first place. So emotionally, intellectually, psychologically, it's an entirely different thing. So even though both of them may require rolling, both of them may require applying Gs, both of them, require managing your energy, there's a very different in terms of their application. And one of the problems is that not only is this not well understood by a lot of regulators, by a lot of pilots, frankly, it's probably not understood by a lot of UPRT providers that had taught aerobatics for a year and said, oh, we're calling aerobatics UPRT now? Well, I'll just change the name. And they wouldn't be able to tell you what the difference is, or they might be teaching skills not only were not transferable to a transport category aircraft, but they could actually involve what's called negative transfer of skill. So if I teach somebody something in an extra 300 or a Cy Marchetti or some other jet that would be bad for them to do in a corporate jet or an airliner, we can actually make the situation worse rather than better.
Everybody I've ever talked to who has done a UPRT course, including many who have flown at APS, says the biggest takeaway is obvious, which is in an upset, basically your first instinct needs to be push. And that's the last thing on your mind when you actually get upset. So without getting into the vagaries of the VG diagram here, why is push so important in an upset? Is there a simple way to remember the aerodynamics behind this?
Sure, I'll explain it in ways that every pilot listening will be able to relate to. We know that when we pull back on the yoke or the stick, we feel a little bit heavy in the seat. Why do we feel heavy? Well, we've created a little bit more lift. How did we do that? We increased our angle of attack. But for most pilots, that's about where it ends. What they don't realize is that the converse is true, that if I nudge the stick or the yoke forward, they've probably at one time or another made themselves feel a little bit light in the seat. They just haven't connected the dots to go, why do I feel the light in the seat? Oh, that's because I'm reducing my angle of attack. Now, when we look at the loss of control in flight accidents, as many as there are, around a little bit more or less than 50%, depending on which sector of aviation we're talking about, are related to stalls. And so if we have a mechanism that I can apply in any aircraft across the fleet of unloading and know whether I have an angle of attack indicator on the aircraft or not, that if I unload, that's reducing my angle of attack, then I have an extremely powerful tool that is useful in a Cessna, a Learjet, any aircraft that we would go on to fly. Because that half a G, and I got to make sure that people understand that we aren't talking ever about going to negative G, because then the fuel might not flow to our engine. And more importantly, if we have passengers that aren't strapped in, they could at least hit their heads or worse. So we're just talking about a light in the seat feel, which means that we've reduced our angle of attack. Now, obviously that helps in terms of a stall, but it also can help in a nose high situation, because if I'm at a half a G and gravity's at 1G, gravity's going to win. It's going to help me to lower my nose. You might ask, how does reducing my angle of attack help me if I'm nose low, below the horizon? And the answer is that you can still be nose low below the horizon and still be stalled, even though most pilots haven't experienced that. But even if I'm not stalled, if I've got any bank angle at all, I need to unload to maximize the roll rate of their aircraft. And those are the kinds of detailed, nuanced information that doesn't come out of our practice of unusual attitude recovery in most simulators or in most aircraft. So that's what's behind push, is unloading.
And what's the most common real world upset scenario that happens in the world? Is it the dreaded wake turbulence on final? Is it pilot induced? It's slow speed? What is the scenario that you're most likely trying to prevent?
It is a stall. And as I just referred to, that's around 50%. And the reason that should be kind of surprising to most pilots is because most pilots feel like they do stall training on a regular basis. If you're a professional pilot and you're going to simulator training every 6 months, 9 months, every year, then people think that they're doing stall training. I did a little trick. I was with a group of roundtable of chief pilots, and I said, how many pilots did stall training the last time they went to the simulator? And all the hands go up. And I said, I'm sorry, you guys, but you're supposed to recover at the first indication of a stall. That is not actually a stall. That is an approach to stall. But we as an industry have convinced ourselves that stalls aren't a problem. We recover from those all of the time. Therefore, we will never get there. But the evidence, the data, the statistics show that that's not true. Now, it turns out that a pilot, whether they're a commercial, airline, ATP, whatever, is only going to have to do a full aerodynamic stall one time in their life, and that is on a private pilot check ride. Because when they go for a commercial pilot check ride, they can recover when the stall is imminent. So you're just at a buffet. You haven't exceeded the critical angle of attack. And that at ATP, we're going to recover at the first indication of stall. So all of those chief pilots recovered at the first indication of stall. And because of that, John, we have this huge blind spot on how the behavior of any fixed wing aircraft is going to be different beyond critical angle of attack. And the original airplane upset recovery training aid laid it out for pilots. They said there's 4 things that every fixed wing pilot or every fixed wing aircraft is going to do in the stall. Buffeting, most pilots are familiar with that. Lack of pitch authority. We know that we pull the yoke back, the nose won't come up anymore. We wouldn't necessarily call it, will you look at that? I've lost my pitch authority. But the third one is a lateral instability, a lack of roll control. And what we're talking about here is not the sluggishness and controls that we get to at slow flight. We're talking about no kidding, the wing is going to drop uncommanded. The airplane is going to be rolling without our inputs. And so for the majority of pilots, if they ever experience this, they're going to be experiencing it for the very first time on their own without ever having anybody shown them that this could happen or what they could do about it. So if they do what a normal pilot would do, the right wing drops in a stall, they try and level the wings. The aileron comes down, that adds more drag. That is actually a pro-spin input. So for those of us that deal with pilots on a regular basis and see the product of licensing training, which is perfect for the normal envelope, we are not surprised at all why the loss of control in flight statistics are the way they are. There is a gap in what we are doing to prepare pilots for flying outside of the envelope. And so, as an industry, our approach to loss of control in flight is we hope it doesn't happen. And it is very rare. In fact, it just happens to be exceedingly catastrophic. There is no category of causal factors that causes more fatalities or a higher percentage of fatalities. It's like 94% fatal in loss of control in flight. There are a lot more runway excursions, okay, but you wiped your gear out, you get out of the airplane, you go home. Loss of control in flight is different. It's permanent. You may only get one in your life. So even if it's only rare, if you have not prepared for it ahead of time, you may not be able to come up with the counterintuitive skills that are required because you didn't receive them through licensing. And so when we look at it systematically, we find that there are 4 problems, 4 sort of invalid assumptions that we make about pilot training that doesn't really apply when it comes to upsets. And the first one is just that the airplane isn't going to leave the normal envelope. Well, we kind of know that's not true. And our evidence that we don't expect the airplane is going to leave the normal envelope is that we don't require training beyond 60 degrees of bank, 30 degrees of pitch. The second thing is that we think that the training that's required by licensing is going to be sufficient when pilots get into an upset. And we know, again, that that's not true because we have to do certain things in an upset that could be very different what we do in a normal envelope. The third is that the pilot, not ever having been into this domain, is going to recognize what's going on. They're going to be able to adequately orient themselves and understand, oh, I've never had my lift vector below the horizon because I'm at 95 degrees of bank. I need to use the controls differently. That is not going to occur to them in the 6 to 10 seconds that they have in an upset event. And then the last invalid assumption is that pilots that have never been here before, never experienced this, never been told that the aerodynamics are different, are going to respond in a way that is reliable and predictable. And so we have these accidents where you read it afterwards and pilots, armchair pilots, are second guessing the pilot involved going, well, that's silly. Why didn't they just do this? And they are taking out of it the human factors that were involved there and the fact that the pilot has never been there before. And a lot of those pilots, when I fly with them, behave in exactly the way that the pilots in the accident did.
Randy, let's take a quick break and we'll be back with some more questions.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at sportys.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at sportys.com/pilot training. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Randy Brooks. And Randy, I want to play a little devil's advocate for a minute. We sometimes hear from people that aren't quite sure on UPRT that they'll say, well, there's famous accidents like Colgan 3407, Air France 447, accidents that most listeners probably can visualize right now. And say, well, yeah, these were these weren't really upsets. It was just poor airmanship. They got too slow and they failed at basic attitude instrument flying. So shouldn't we just teach people not to lose control in the first place? What do you say to that?
Well, when I got involved in this subject area, it was called upset recovery training. And the kind of argument that you're espousing is what we heard a lot, which is that we shouldn't teach pilots to recover from upsets. We should teach pilots to not have an upset in the first place, to which we go, okay, we couldn't possibly agree with you more. How is that working for us? Because really, is not all of existing licensing training to try and help us prevent us from getting into an upset? The answer is yes, it is. And so for the people that favor prevention, we will tell them that if prevention is what you like, the absolute best way to enhance prevention is to provide upset prevention and recovery training. And we added the prevention to upset recovery training to communicate to people that it is an entire spectrum. And the reason that UPRT provides prevention is because when we take pilots through our course, they're going to see the escalation to an upset in a variety of different ways, dozens of times. And what that does is it changes their mental model about what the flight path of the aircraft is going to be and what its behavior is going to be in the aircraft. And it enhances their pattern recognition, right? So they are going to see that upset coming in ways that they never could have before and be able to cut it off at a pass. So I referred earlier to teaching people fancy flying skills, and we do that, and we teach them how to access it. But probably the biggest benefit of upset prevention recovery training is it keeps pilots from having to use those fancy flying skills in the first place, because it keeps them from getting to the edge of the envelope that they had never even knew was there before.
How about the criticism that I'm going to go fly with you in an extra 300 that rolls 1,000,000 degrees a second, and then I'm going to go home and get my sluggish, whatever it is, 182 Learjet that doesn't roll anything like an extra? And can I really transfer the learning from that aerobatic airplane into my standard category airplane?
Well, yes and no. It depends on the instructor, because all the extra is a tool, and it depends on how the instructor is going to use that tool. When I'm using that tool, let's see, earlier this week I was flying, I've had pilots in the last week flying PC-12s, flying Gulfstreams, and I have a working knowledge of those aircraft. And so I know what they can get away with and what they can't. And we're going to be flying the extra not like it's an extra, but like it's a PC-12 or like it's a G550. And so they're going to be limited. In the case of the PC-12, I think it's got a limit load a little bit over 3 Gs, but most transport category jets are only 2.5 Gs, so that's all they get. It's easy to recover extra Pitts and F-16, but it's not so easy when I have a slower roll rate and a smaller margin. And so the instructor has to be the master of how to use that and impart the aerodynamic considerations there to use it effectively. So just because the extra can roll at 300 plus degrees a second doesn't mean that we need to do it. We just need to impart the concept that you might need to roll as fast as your King Air can roll to get the lift vector reoriented to vertical before you exceed red line. So those are the kind of academic connect the dots that the instructor has to introduce. And I'll just put a little bit, stand on my soapbox about UPRT instructors for a second. Per the FAA, I have a CFI in gliders first, and in airplanes, instrument and multi-engine. But I will tell you that the knowledge and the skills that are required to be a good upset prevention and recovery training instructor are greater than all of the skills and knowledge combined with all of those different ratings that I have on my CFI. Now, I don't know that there will ever be a CFI UPRT, but I do think people need to know and understand, look at the background of your UPRT instructor. How are they, what standards are they applying to? We have mastery standards that we're putting in place here at APS that speak to our ability to provide training to pilots in piston, turboprop, and jet aircraft to use all of the different training platforms that we have, whether it's the aircraft, the jet, the simulator, or now even virtual reality. I've added, I've kind of described what it takes to be a good UPRT instructor, I'd love it if you could let it be known that we are always looking for those people. We have the most sophisticated school, we believe, in the world, and there's only certain people that have those skills. But for the right person, there is nothing more rewarding than the job that I get paid for. So if you think that you would be interested in being an upset prevention recovery training instructor, look on the APS website and send us a resume.
All right, Randy, we always close Pilot's Discretion with a lightning round we call Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. You ready to copy?
I am.
What's the most common reaction new pilots have during an upset event?
It's interesting. Where I see it is on our first demonstration of the slipping stall, which isn't even as dramatic as the skidded stall. And we have had them in class. We've shown them the aerodynamics, how they have a different lift distribution in the aircraft, and why when they get to the stall, the airplane, in most cases, is going to rapidly roll to about 90 degrees of bank. We've shown them a video on the screen from the cockpit. This is what it's going to look like. And yet the first time they experience it themselves in the airplane, or when we demonstrate it, it's wow, it's expletive deleted. I didn't know it could do that. And all of a sudden, it opens up their brain to the fact that there is stuff in flying that they may have never seen before. This happens to pilots with 5,000, 10,000 hours, and they're going, you're kidding me. I've got an ATP, I've got 6 type ratings, and I've been going to training for years, and nobody told me that there are these aspects of performance that all of the aircraft that I've been flying could subject me to, and this training hasn't prepared me for it. That's the paradigm shift that we experience that's very rewarding to see.
Is there a skill I should practice before I go for UPRT? Should I practice crosswind landings or steep turns or airspeed control or instrument flying? Does anything help?
Yes, John, all of the above, because what you have just described with all of those are manual flying skills. And we tend to talk about stick and rudder skills, but Chief Scientist for the FAA, Dr. Kathy Abbott, corrected me. The correct term is manual flight operations proficiency. And the reason for that is that it's not just about our hands and feet, it's also about our brain. And so if you think about a pilot doing a manual hand-flown approach when they've been flying ILSs in their Airbus or 737 5 days a week, those kind of skills can erode. Now, one of the side benefits of UPRT is that manual flight operations skill. We use the autopilot sparingly in the S211, but in the extra, you're going to be out there flying for all of a 45-minute sortie, and it's going to refine your flying skills when you go back to whatever it is that you normally fly.
What's the right time to do UPRT? Should I do this during primary training, after I get my instrument, when I get a type rating? When would you ideally insert that into the average pilot's training?
We like to tell folks that anytime after their private license, because we don't want to interrupt that process. We know that a lot of people don't cross the finish line and getting their private rating, but boy, that can be the first thing that you do after that, because it is going to be beneficial to anything else that you go on to fly. I will tell you this, there was an FAA aviation rulemaking committee called the Loss of Control Avoidance and Recovery Training Aviation Rulemaking Committee. It met back in 2013. And their recommendation is that all commercial pilots should have UPRT, as they phrased it, in actual flight, meaning on an airplane, not in a simulator, prior to commercial licensing. Now, obviously, the FAA did not act on that. EASA in Europe has actually partially acted on that. But, there is a different standard that we expect for private pilots and commercial pilots. But, any pilot and their passengers are going to benefit, but we want to make sure that they have the foundational flying skills that the private license provides first.
Flight path management. This is a crucial concept, in my opinion, a part of UPRT, but something that's not that well understood. Can you explain what that means in one sentence?
The primary responsibility of every pilot is to manage their flight path. That's clearly stated in Advisory Circular 120-123, which just came out about a little over a year ago. And what is important about that advisory circular is that it puts in front of us, the things that we've always heard: aviate, navigate, communicate. Aviate is first, and that's what flight path management is. Now, what's important about that advisory circular? It doesn't say that that's the pilot's first responsibility in the normal flight envelope, but they've abdicated their responsibility if they have an upset. It is still the pilot's responsibility. And I will subject that how is the pilot expected to properly manage their flight path in an upset if they have not had upset prevention and recovery training?
Let's talk airshow world. You spent a lot of time doing that. What's the most underappreciated airshow maneuver? Something that looks really simple from the ground, but is really hard to do in the airplane.
Well, first of all, I love flying formation aerobatics. I grew up watching the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds. I've watched both of them fly in 6 different aircraft types, I believe, over the years from when I, was 5, 6 years old, going to air shows with my father. And so that's what I aspire to. And I do believe that you have to have aerobatic proficiency, but the formation maneuvering goes a little bit further. Then the aircraft that you're flying has a little bit to do with it. I flew air shows both in the 450 Stearman with Red Baron Squadron and in a 4-ship of Pitts Specials with the Holiday Inn aerobatic team. The Pitts gave us more capability, so we could actually do formation changes in an aerobatic maneuver, as a lot of people have seen the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds go from the arrowhead to a diamond loop or trail to diamond roll. Now we're talking about some things that only a small segment of even aerobatic pilots can do. And then as a formation pilot, I used to fly cross country, flying upside down for 5 minutes, rolling over, catching my breath, flying upside down for another 5 minutes until I could fly formation as well upside down as right side up, because that again separates the beginner formation pilots from the seasoned airshow professionals.
I would say so. 5 minutes upside down sounds like a long time. Describe flying an L-39 in 10 words or less. This is something you did a lot of when you worked for Eclipse, right? Did training in L-39s, a popular jet that people have probably seen at air shows, right?
That's correct. There's a lot of L-39s out there. I'll compare that to the S-211 that I'm flying now. It is rugged and built strong like tractor because its design philosophy was designed as a Soviet trainer, but it was a second generation basic training aircraft, follow on to the L-29. And so they had perfected a lot of things. And I loved that airplane. Very easy to fly, great, robust trainer, trailing link landing gear, very dependable. But now I'm flying the Italian S-211, the Sio Marchetti. And the difference is it's about 10 years later, a little bit more refined, boosted aileron, slightly swept wings. So we like it a little bit better for the upset prevention recovery training role because it has a wing that is a little bit closer to the swept wing on a lot of corporate jets. But they're both just a lot of fun, and I just am grateful. Tomorrow morning, I'm doing a high altitude sortie to above 32,000 feet in our S-211, and I'm just very grateful that I get the opportunity to do this type of flying.
I think I remember you did some air shows in a glider, if I'm not mistaken.
Now we're in trivia here, John. Yes, in fact.
What's the biggest difference flying an air show in a glider versus a traditional airplane like a Pitts or a Stearman?
Well, first of all, I've been on 3 formation teams. I mentioned the other 2. The third is a 2-ship glider act using 2 Schweitzer 126s called 2 Cool gliders. And you can only do one maneuver in formation in a glider, in that particular glider, and that's a loop. So you do it one on the x-axis, one on the y-axis. You make it look like 2 separate maneuvers. People will never tell. The rest of the things are either simultaneous or opposing maneuvers. But we would have to brief 3 different profiles. We'd brief if we got lift, we're doing it this way. This is nominal. This is, we got a little bit of sink. And fortunately, the pilot that I was flying with, Kyoki Gray, amazing pilot himself, a natural, we had flown together thousands of hours, both with both air show teams in the Stearman and in the Pittses. I had taught him to fly gliders. I had taught him to fly aerobatics. So we had a little bit of that Vulcan mind meld going on, and that really helped us when I had to call audibles in the air. One of the things that I did not appreciate as much about flying the 2-ship glider routine is I like my routine structured. And so for the 4-ship teams that I was on, we worked to make every airshow site, every airshow performance as similar as possible within the constraints of the wind conditions and the airshow site itself. And in the glider world, there were no 2 shows that were exactly alike. And that was, I never quite got used to that in the 2 years that I flew at that team.
What's one tip you can share with a new Stearman pilot? If I'm going to check out in this classic airplane, not the easiest airplane to land, You have a tip for me?
I do. First of all, I'm going to give you two. First of all, it's just an airplane, so don't be intimidated. Remember that a lot of those people that ground looped that airplane only had 200 hours. They had not flown much else. But the other thing is, don't wait until you have a deviation. Look at your nose and stop the deviation. Look for the drift, okay? You're not waiting until you're already headed towards the side of the runway. You're looking at the nose and you're stopping it. And what that will do is allow you to stop, and this can be applied to any tail dragger, stop those deviations at the earliest point possible and therefore make your corrections as small as possible.
That's great advice in any tail dragger, as you said. That's the key. All right, I'm going to put you on the spot. What is harder, learning to fly a tailwheel or learning formation flying?
I would say learning to fly a tailwheel in terms of the tactile skills. Of course, there's a big difference between the J3 and a Pitts and all of the other aircraft in between. But formation, if it's done with a good instructor, can be introduced very, very sequentially. At first, we're just trying to stop relative movement, and then we, close it up. And a lot of formation flying is about the discipline and the procedures and learning to trust the people that you're flying with, as opposed to the flying itself, which with time, in terms of just straight and level here to there, formation flying is not that demanding.
Our last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I'm flying an F-86, and I'm going to fly my first air show in the F-86. I hope that you can be there and watch, John.
That sounds great, and that's a first on this podcast. I've not heard F-86, but that was certainly a dream airplane for me growing up, so I'll definitely show up to watch that, Randy.
Thank you.
Randy, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, it's been fun, John.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.